Welcome to The Riff, where writer and investor Byrne Hobart and I discuss the major inflection points caused by technological change. Our weekly conversation covers the obvious and not so obvious ways in which markets and businesses will adapt as a result. Let's jump right in.
How are you?
I'm doing great. Happy New Year. How are you doing?
Yeah, Happy New Year. It's good to be back.
Yeah, awesome. Shall we get into it?
Let's do it.
Okay, great. You wrote about what we can learn from previous singularities as it relates to economic growth. Why don't you unpack that idea?
Yeah, so there's actually this really fun piece by Robin Hanson a long time ago where he's writing about basically different economic growth paradigms. And his basic claim is that every so often in human history, the rate of growth goes up by about 10x. And that in an agrarian or subsistence economy, you have like 0.01% annualized growth that maybe very slowly we accumulate some level of knowledge about like this plant's poisonous, don't eat it, or this plant is poisonous, but if you prepare it this way, you can't eat it, etc. And so over many, many generations, life slowly changes, information slowly accumulates, but it's just very, very gradual. And then you get to an agrarian economy where there is actually more continuous improvement. There's a little bit more economic specialization and so on. He pegs that at like 0.1% annual growth in output per person. And then industrialization, call that 1%, and that's going to include, early industrialization where we just don't see a ton of GDP impact, although interesting stuff is happening, and then all the way up through like the mid 20th century productivity boom, and including some of that period of slower growth thereafter. And then his claim is, what if that happens again? And note that it's happening on faster time scales than before. So maybe at some point we'll have 10% annual growth, and maybe that'll be for a few years, and then we'll be at 100% annual growth, and maybe things will just keep accelerating past that. And I thought it was actually just a useful framing for saying that sometimes just our intuitions about economic growth have had to change historically, and that for the majority of human history, most people who ever lived, their standard of living was just not materially different from that of their parents, except if things went really badly. And it's more of a 20th century innovation that you do actually expect your kids to have a meaningfully better standard of living than you, and for your grandkids to be just unimaginably rich compared to where you are today. And part of what I thought about in that was just there are just a lot of adjustments that you have to make, and a lot of intuitions that you have to question on what's stable, what's constant, what's not. And also that there are some things that do just stick around and that don't actually change all that much. And that a lot of the oldest companies in the world, they're serving pretty old needs, but actually that banks, for example, there are some really, really old companies that are banks. There's some really, really old universities, and these are that set of institutions that have actually been through at least one singularity or maybe multiple singularities, depending on how you count, and they've survived. So that was kind of like a comforting note that there are things that can actually work in a mostly agrarian economy and work in an industrial economy, and maybe these things will also persist in future kinds of economies. Although I think the other way to frame that is that we do have some survivorship bias, and in particular we have survivorship bias on just what counts as part of the comparison set. So it might be that in 13th century Paris there were actually a lot of places to learn, and it turns out that the one we call a university is the one that actually stuck around. And similar for Oxford, there may have been just other places people would go if they were interested in knowledge that we don't consider part of the relevant comparison set. And so looking forward, maybe we will actually have some concept in the distant future that includes Harvard, includes Stanford, but it also includes Y Combinator. And we just treat these as like slight variants on the general idea of you gather together these cohorts of people who you've selected for various skills and other traits, and you have them located in the same place for a while, socializing for a while, learning from people who are more experienced in the same domain for a while, and then they go out and do their thing. We may just treat that as like a general design pattern rather than tying it to a specific kind of institution.
Relatedly, Tyler Cowen went on Dorkesh's podcast, and if you listen to it, I'm curious for what you found interesting about it. One thing I found interesting about it was that Tyler was only seeing, was it like a 0.5% in GDP growth as it due to AI, and Dorkesh was saying, hey, why won't it be bigger? Why won't we get double digit percentage. If we had, a billion more humans who are super intelligent, wouldn't that, or 10 billion, wouldn't that lead to, increased economic growth? And one thing Tyler said is shrinkage leads to significant, decrease in economic growth, but a significant increase in population won't lead to a proportionate increase in economic growth. That those things are asymmetric, and the biggest bottleneck is just humans' ability to sort of incorporate the AI, because they either don't know how to or won't want to. And so I found that interesting.
Yeah, so I think it is true that economies respond to shrinking and growing populations in different ways, but annoyingly, one of the big features of economies that responds to this in useful ways is one that doesn't really apply to AI, which is just total housing stock. So if you have a growing economy, you have more demand for homes, and when someone like a home, it's kind of a duration bet where you are paying for a home out of year to year income, but the home has to get built up front. So essentially, when there's one incremental household added to the population, we have to buy, a half century of household years of housing in order to accommodate that household. So if you have a growing population, you need a financial system that can make very long-term loans like mortgages, or like, mortgages to individual home buyers, or long-term loans to people who are buying, to property developers and to landlords and things. And if you have a shrinking economy, then you have housing stock where it's gradually declining in value, so it's a lot harder to lend against it. Like, it's, if you lend to just the median American home and it's a 30-year mortgage, it is extremely likely that by the end of that 30-year period, that home is worth more than the face value of the mortgage. Like, housing prices tend to go up. But if you are lending to a homeowner in Japan and you think the number of households in Japan will actually shrink over time, then you don't have that assumption. Now, Japan kind of conveniently has this incredibly weird housing market where houses depreciate really fast, in both accounting terms and just literal physical wear and tear terms. They tend to get knocked down and then rebuilt. And so Japan has kind of a fluctuating housing stock that does actually respond to supply and demand shocks. But in a country where housing is a more durable asset, it does create some growth, because it means that every new household requires this fixed investment, and that fixed investment does lead to a lot of immediate spending. But it also means that shrinkage leads to this overhang. Now, I slightly disagree with the claim, though, that there aren't. Well, I guess it depends on how that claim is actually framed. I have not read the full interview, unfortunately, so I can't. I don't know if Tyler or Drokesh actually addressed this, but one of the gains from scale is that if there's some 1 in a million talent, it's just a lot more likely that your population has it if you have a million people. And if you are looking at a population in the billions, or suddenly you have AI agents, so it's a population in the tens or hundreds or whatever billions, then it's much more likely to have those specializations. On the other hand, that's a case where the AI argument is actually weaker, because it's not like you have 100 billion discrete, completely unique AI agents. You actually have 100 billion agents that all have some of the same underlying patterns and are trained on some of the same data. So that's one piece. But also, there are just pure gains from scale, in the sense that there are things where there are products where there's an experience curve. So as you manufacture more units of this product, the product gets cheaper, and so you can deploy it in more places, and that has it's a nice virtuous cycle. And you just have more end demand for that product if you have a larger population. So this is a point that Neil Stevenson makes in the book Seven Eves, where I think it's hard to talk about anything interesting in the book without giving away spoilers, but there is an event that causes the population of Earth to collapse, and the story follows people who launch into space, and those are the surviving humans. And then the story zooms forward by 5,000 years, and you're looking at this distant future population where the human population has roughly recovered to where it was before this cataclysm. And it's only at that point that they start to be able to economically manufacture devices that have the performance of modern smartphones, because before that, there just aren't enough people to buy enough chips in order to support the fixed cost of really, really advanced foundries. So you just don't have them. And I think there's potentially something to that, but that is also a case where specifically imagining population growth through AI models once again means that you don't have that direct benefit, except for the AI hardware itself, because those models, they don't really consume anything other than GPU capacity, and then indirectly electricity and, I guess, data. But they don't have other needs, and so there aren't other scale benefits to just manufacturing more stuff for them. So yeah, I could see, but then going back to Tyler's original estimate, like I do think that a lot of the speed limit for adopting AI is set by just institutional reluctance to totally change everything about their behavior in response to some new technology, even though if you started the same institution with that technology in existence, you would have done things very differently. And you can kind of illustrate how hard that sort of transition is with the desktop to mobile transition, which I think is probably socially less of a big deal than AI. Certainly has less potential upside than AI does from right now. But that transition was hard even for companies that saw it coming pretty early and recognized that this was a really big deal. So Facebook, they were very early to seeing that a lot of online activity would move to mobile, but they still struggled to build a good app. The first version of the Facebook mobile app was just not a great app and didn't perform well. Users did not like it. They had to rebuild it basically. And then they also had to figure out how to monetize. And so things looked kind of dicey for a while, even though this was a company that it was very technical, had very forward-looking leadership, and knew that this was supposed to be their main priority. So if it's hard for Meta to make that transition, it's probably very, very hard for, I don't know, Accenture or someone else. Like, these are well-run companies. They're full of competent people, but they have not had to build their business around seeing disruptions in technology and rebuilding themselves in the face of those disruptions. I think if there were a company that was like Accenture, except at some point in their history they had reduced headcount by 90% and revenue had kept going up, then you'd say that business services company probably is ready for this. But if such a company exists, it is probably right now in that process of shrinking headcount by 90% and not having any effect on revenue growth. So yeah, I think those kinds of adoption questions, they do slow down how quickly new technologies like AI get deployed. On the other hand, if different institutions adopt AI at different paces, and adopting it does mean faster growth, then at looking forward from any given point, more economic growth is going to be represented by the companies and institutions that were early adopters. And so eventually those companies end up just swallowing the rest of the economy because they outgrow it.
Speaking with, because you mentioned Meta, actually using that as a segue, Zuckerberg went on Rogan the other day, and he also came out with his sort of big changes of how they're thinking about fact checking and going to a community notes model and just moderation in general. And besides the broader topics of sort of the continued vibe shift, how far will it go? Sort of, I also thought was interesting was he was saying that we've moved too much towards feminism, is kind of a feminized workplace, and you couldn't say that 2 years ago, and even if you were just a random employee. Now Mark Zuckerberg saying that, it's pretty crazy. So I guess the high-level questions I have is how far is vibe shift going to go, and how far is the bounce back to whenever, because if it's a pendulum, how far that's going to be? Are we going to go back to the moderate, like what it was 10 years ago, or are we going to do something even further left? There's just some high-level questions that are somewhat unanswerable, so you may not have a take, but you have some broader thoughts on just the moderation challenge and just what this means more broadly.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about that, about Meta and their changes in moderation, one of the things that occurred to me was they've actually done a really good job. And they publish these quarterly reports that walk through all the different kinds of content that exist on their sites that they don't like, or that users don't like, or they're actively illegal. And they have these metrics on how often do posts like that get flagged by users versus how often do they get flagged by Meta's own moderation systems. And the one that I always looked at, because the first time I looked at one of these reports, it was like early 2020, and the place that stood out as being unusually hard to monitor was bullying and harassment, where it was something like 80% of the time someone had to flag it for Facebook. They would not actually detect this on their own service. And I think a pretty clear reason for that is that if you get a bunch of messages from someone, it's possible that they are a good friend of yours and they're really chatty and they're keeping in touch. It's also possible that they're harassing you. And if the content of those messages is things like nice shirt, that might be a genuine compliment. That might be a really cutting remark. It's just very hard to tell. And so it seems like a naturally difficult thing to moderate. But they have that relationship is flipped. So now 80% of the time, bullying and harassment gets detected in advance, and only 20% of the time does it get flagged by users before Meta's own tools have automatically spotted it. And that actually seems like a really big accomplishment and a really interesting one, and that probably the people who were responsible for that just know a lot about the nature of bullying that is just not known by anybody else because Meta is operating at such a large scale. But I tried to find any reporting on this, and I really couldn't. And I was poking around just trying to find cases where journalists had written about how Meta used to have really bad moderation, used to be able to get away with anything, and now you can't, or even pieces doing retrospectives on Russian election interference and saying, well, 100K in Facebook spending did not swing the election. And like my question on that has always been, where are the slightly shady Russian digital marketing firms that will just hint to you that their employees worked for the Russian government in late 2016 and did a really good job at projects they can't specify? Like, I don't know that anyone has actually made that pitch. And I'm sure there are marketers out there who would love to hire an agency if they thought that that agency for 100K could swing an election. So surely for 10K, it can make your DTC brand really, really popular. But that does not exist. That sales pitch does not exist because people who have large digital marketing budgets just don't think that the story of Russian election interference was at all credible. And even if they thought it was credible at the time, if they've looked into it and tried to reverse engineer, well, okay, what would I do if I were a Russian and Russian intelligence service person, and my mandate is swing a U.S. presidential election, and my budget is literally six figures? And there isn't a good answer. There isn't actually some magic trick that they learned for manipulating public opinion on Facebook that got them all that leverage. So there was a lot of really negative coverage of Facebook, and I think the attitude at Facebook was probably that they had made some genuine mistakes, and it was correct for them to be called out directionally, but the magnitude was wrong. And that the way for them to address this was take every claim that is being made in the media and either refute it because it is false or make it false. And so Meta hired just armies of people to manually review things. They came up with incredibly elaborate rules for what is allowed, what's not allowed. How do we parse these incredibly narrow edge cases? And just how do we make our moderation really clean and systematic? And I think the two things that happened, one was that broadly, this did not lead to a complete revamp of media attitudes towards Mark Zuckerberg. Like, I feel like he might have just been looking at the ROI of various things he's done to improve his image and said, well, we spent billions and billions of dollars building the world's most elaborate content moderation system. And also one time I bought a gold chain. And one of these actually made me significantly more popular than the other. So I'm just going to buy another gold chain next time. So that was one piece. And the other one was Wall Street Journal has this article claiming that Mark Zuckerberg was mad that he posted a picture of his injury, and it was him in a hospital bed saying he's really happy to get back to training, martial arts training, once he's healed. And he was annoyed that it didn't get much traction and asked why that was. And it was because it was a post that was referencing medical operations, and this triggered some kind of indicator that it might be a conspiracy theory, so Meta limited its reach. And with that, I think there's this qualitative difference between Elon Musk just being sad that his tweets aren't more popular and telling the Twitter engineers, okay, you need to alter the algorithm so that if username equals Elon Musk, increase its reach. And someone like Zuckerberg, where he could look at that and just say, it wasn't intuitive to him that this post would not have reach. He had to ask someone at Meta, but he's probably been in meetings multiple times a week for a decade now talking about moderation. So if someone who dictated what the goals of the process were and managed it very closely does not actually understand how this system works, then nobody understands how the system works, and it will just constantly be giving users negative surprises. So Meta PR did try to shoot down this claim that Mark Zuckerberg was sad that his hospital selfie did not get enough traction on Meta. But I think that it's actually totally legitimate for a CEO to say that when he's interacting with his own company's products and has a frustrating experience that doesn't make sense, that something is deeply wrong. In fact, it seems like an echo of the infamous Bill Gates memo, where he sent this email to a bunch of senior Microsoft executives saying that he tried to watch a movie on Windows, and that he had to download this codec and then had to download this other media player, and then he has to go to Microsoft's site and he has to search for something, and then there are like three things with similar names. He doesn't know which to click. And at one point, which just like, you just have to imagine the sinking feeling you get if you are reading this memo and you know that your team was responsible for this. He says something like, and now I have a fun little puzzle, or something. It's something like that. Like he's genuinely enjoying how furious he is with this. But I think it's sometimes just a useful indicator if the CEO is mad about something and is confused about something the company is doing, it means that the company has an over elaborate process that no one can actually understand, that no one has good intuitions on. And so I think the combination of those things was just pretty good evidence that moderation on Meta is about as good as it's going to be. It is at this efficient frontier. That part of the payoff was supposed to be better PR. Now he has other ways to get better PR, like just being a little bit more of a bro. And and because he didn't get, like, Meta just didn't get a lot of credit for overdoing moderation, they're going to underdo it instead. And, that you can read that as this really petty thing where Meta was doing something to impress the media. The media were not obligated to be impressed, and they weren't impressed. And so Meta stopped doing it. But I think that I think that the other way to read that is Meta's moderation was better than it was economically rational for Meta to make it, because they wanted this PR benefit. They really did care about media perception of them. And they thought that a lot of the coverage was just earnest coverage from well-informed people who disagreed with them. And then once they changed the facts on the ground, it did not change the nature of the coverage all that much. They decided that it actually wasn't really earnest at all and that they had wasted their money.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Most of you probably know how much the Turpentine team loves Notion, the sponsor of today's episode. We use it every day for editorial planning, transcript markups, project managing, knowledge sharing, and it's where I drop random 3 a.m. ideas that turn into episodes. Now it has the power of AI, built right inside of Notion and woven across our entire workspace. It's been a total game changer for our productivity and focus. We just used it the other day to architect the content schedule for next month across our network. Notion combines your notes, docs, and projects into one space that's simple and beautifully designed. The fully integrated Notion AI helps you work faster, write better, and think bigger, doing tasks that normally take you hours in just seconds. Try Notion for free when you go to notion.com/upstreampod. That's all lowercase letters. Notion.com/upstreampod to try the powerful, easy-to-use Notion AI today. And when you use our link, you're supporting our show. That's notion.com/upstreampod.
Trust isn't just earned, it's demanded. Whether you're a startup founder navigating your first audit or a seasoned security professional scaling your GRC program, proving your commitment to security has never been more critical or more complex. That's where Vanta comes in. Businesses use Vanta to establish trust by automating compliance needs across over 35 frameworks like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. Centralize security workflows, complete questionnaires up to 5 times faster, and proactively manage vendor risk. Vanta can help you start or scale your security programming by connecting you with auditors and experts to conduct your audit and set up your security program quickly. Plus, with automation and AI throughout the platform, Vanta gives you time back so you can focus on building your company. Join over 9,000 global companies like Atlassian, Quora, and Factory who use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. For a limited time, listeners get $1,000 off Vanta at vanta.com/revolution. That's VANTA.com/revolution for $1,000 off.
Yeah, huge own goal in some ways by the left, and not appreciating. I mean, it seems like Mark is taking the Elon sort of strategy in terms of Elon tried to, I don't know how consciously, but he was certainly trying to collaborate or trying to appeal, and at one point sort of came to the realization of, like, no matter how hard I try, or no matter what, this group of people is going to hate me or alienate me, and so whether I am mildly in support of them or extremely against them, it's kind of the same outcome. And maybe by being against them, I can appeal to some other demographic. So as opposed to being the enemy of everyone, I at least have one tribe. Maybe it's too crude of a calculus, but it seems like directionally.
It's entirely possible that there is some standard that a tech CEO could reach where they're going to get pretty universally positive coverage. And I don't see very many negative stories about Satya or Microsoft. And I don't think that it's because they are just massively better behaved than other big tech companies, but for whatever reason, they just aren't that much of a target. It may just be that they have fewer consumer facing brands, and so it just doesn't play as well to go after them. But it may be possible, but it may be that Zuckerberg and Musk are just not that good at playing that game. They're good at other things, but not at that. So yeah, I don't know how much of it is just purely unfairness, how much of it is just that there are very high standards for such things. And especially if you're writing at the New York Times, your perspective on what good moderation is kind of influenced by the fact that you have an editor and that a lot of thought goes into what appears on the front page. And the Times is just not going to run a story usually that is very thinly sourced, and they can't get a lot of confirmation for it. And it also doesn't make much sense. Whereas you can post that on Facebook and it's probably more viral than something purely factual. It's a lot more interesting if you could just make stuff up. So I think they may just have this standard that is basically the Facebook home, like the news feed should be like the front page of the New York Times, and it's never going to be that. Or if it is that, that's a comparatively uninteresting feature of a world where we do have world-class human level performance in all information processing job related domains. So we probably, yeah, I guess like it would be funny if that is how Meta got there, that if they were actually able to produce a better New York Times than the New York Times, that the New York Times would stop criticizing them. But at that point, the New York Times is irrelevant. And I think there's a little, like, it is probably vulgar Marxism to say that everyone criticizing Facebook, from every journalist criticizing Facebook, is partly criticizing this threat to their own livelihood. But it's also true that if you work at a big media organization, part of why you are paid the way you are paid is that your work has really wide distribution. And if Facebook interferes with that, if Facebook means that there just isn't as much of a centralized media ecosystem and that everyone is reading the front page of their own custom newspaper, that is just a threat to someone who's working at a very large, high-profile institution. That person has a platform. They can complain. They will be listened to. They're also smart, articulate. They know how to write. So their complaints will actually sound really good. And that is something to adjust for. You always, I think, like anytime there's a dispute and there's a really well articulated argument on one side of it, you always want to ask yourself, is having some economic interest in this outcome winning? Is that selected for, or does that also select for being really skilled at making the argument? So like when you look at, I think I compared this in the post, like Hollywood strikes, the people who are writing slogans on the signs that the strikers hold, they are professional writers. That's their whole job, is like make this look really, really good in a clip or in a shot. And of course, the videos, they're being produced by people who are really good at video. And the people holding the signs, they have all gotten hired by being really attractive people who are very charismatic and are able to just dominate a scene if they choose to. So you just have a lot of people who have a really, really nice edge in getting their point across. And then on the other side, I'm sure, as in any other job, being a Hollywood executive is probably easier if you are just a really attractive, really charismatic person, but you don't have to be in the same way that you do to actually star in the movie. So and of course the executives do have the advantage that they are fine with missing a paycheck or two here and there. They will probably not notice, and their company has a lot more resources, and Disney can borrow for much lower rates and in much larger dollar amounts than the Screen Actors Guild. So there are advantages on both sides, but I think that is one worth thinking about if you're trying to assess the merits of the argument by looking at each side's argument, is that that may be that the side that has the people who are really, really good at arguing is not necessarily the right side.
Yeah, it is interesting. There was this broader sort of question around when, OpenAI and New York Times, it was reported that New York Times was suing OpenAI, that is sort of this conversation of, oh, hey, could OpenAI just create a better New York Times, way easier than the New York Times could create a better OpenAI? There's kind of this broader sort of thing around like, shape rotators can be word cells, easier than word cells can be shape rotators. Do you think that's a bit too glib in the sense of OpenAI can never sort of build New York Times, or that's not kind of how power structure goes? And decades from now, the New York Times is still going to be the New York Times, or do you think no, there's actually something to that, and it's unlikely that the New York Times will maintain the credibility that it has?
Yeah, I think the problem thinking about that is I think from the STEM perspective, if you say we could build a better New York Times, then one of the questions is, well, who's going to say it's a better New York Times? And if the New York Times has the New York Times brand name and OpenAI has the New Times and that's their brand name, people will tend to just choose the New York Times, the established brand name, over the new one. And they will probably look down on people who like the new thing, especially if the new thing was made by a robot in a data center and not made by actual living, breathing journalists. And then if you decide, okay, we're actually going to come up with some measurable criteria, well, then you are kind of playing into the STEM side's hand. You're playing to their strengths, because once you have measurable criteria, once you have a goal function, and you have a set of programs that are basically arbitrary goal pursuers, then of course you win, because you're deciding to you're saying, I'm going to throw my arbitrary optimizer at a specific optimization problem. But writing the New York Times is not a specific optimization problem. There isn't a rubric that I can come up with right now that tells me what is the thing for the New York Times to be in the year 2026 or the year 2036. It is more of this ongoing series of judgment calls. So yeah, I don't think you'll be able to make really good comparisons specifically for hard news, because there's like this weird interaction effect where you want coverage of what matters, but if you're the New York Times, the things you cover are the things that matter. And so it's very hard to measure. Like, it is true that the New York Times is early to a lot of important issues, but it's because those issues got important because the New York Times started covering them. So if an OpenAI news product does not have that advantage, then it's just not the New York Times. It is performing one of the many functions of the New York Times, but it's not performing the elite coordination, the deciding what it is that you talk about if you're an important person talking to important people thing. That's not decided by them. Now, in the case of business news, I think you could do that. You could actually, I think it is more plausible to build a better Wall Street Journal that is entirely AI generated than to build a better New York Times, because with business news, you can actually measure it. You can basically ask if someone is subscribed to publication A versus publication B, after 10 years, who has more money? In fact, this was literally a Wall Street Journal. One of the most effective sales letters of all time was just a Wall Street Journal copywriter imagining two people, one of whom subscribes to the journal, one of whom doesn't, and that the one who does is just always on the ball, always knows what's happening. He's always getting promoted, and he meets up with his high school buddy or college buddy years later and doesn't understand why his friend just can't get a break and can't keep a job, doesn't get promoted, etc. So like, it is. I think that the goal function is better specified for business news than for other kinds of news. And so you can make that comparison more relevantly there. But also the business news stuff, it matters a lot, but I think it probably decides fewer of the really fundamental existential questions than the other news does.
I want to segue to make sure we cover some of your other topics. You wrote about the loneliness economy and how that's kind of changed in a post-COVID world. When do you talk about what you were trying to say there?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a rehash of the same. Like, one side has a goal function, can measure and optimize, and the other one doesn't. So the impetus for that article was a really good piece in the Atlantic that was talking about the rise of loneliness. If you look at the chart, be sure to read the axes very carefully, because it is talking about change in time spent at home per, I forget if it's week or day. I should actually check that. But anyway, what it shows is, okay, people were spending a little more time at home alone each year. And then there's obviously a huge spike in 2020, and then it doesn't fully mean revert. In fact, we basically got another decade and a half worth of incremental loneliness in 3 years, and it hasn't gone back down. And I think that one thing that happened there was that if you switch from going out to staying in, if you switch from hanging out with other people to watching your feed, watching your streaming shows, looking at your feed, etc., you have opted into a situation where you're giving a lot of feedback that allows that thing to improve. And socializing will slowly improve over time. Like, it is a skill. You can actually get better at it. You can learn to ask really good probing questions and also learn to back off, and you get closer to your friends over time, and there's all that stuff. But it doesn't have the same relentless march of improvement that the apps do. And then if you think of dining out versus eating in, again, DoorDash has better data on every single person's preferences every time any person makes an order. So they are constantly accumulating more and more data that makes them a better option. And the broader space of physical restaurants just doesn't capture as much data. They don't have, for example, as much information about what do you consider before you actually make your final determination. And, for DoorDash, like, if you are scrolling through the appetizers and you pause when you see pot stickers, but you don't actually purchase pot stickers, they know that you can be tempted by pot stickers. Their data scientists will crunch the numbers, try to estimate at what point in the week you are at your hungriest / least executive function. They will send you a push notification, say that you can get discounted pot stickers, and then they will get the incremental order from you. So when we opt into interacting with any system that's going to optimize in order to get us to do what it wants, then that system is going to keep getting better. And when a bunch of us do that all at once because it's 2020, there's nothing else to do, then we have permanently given those systems much better data that will indefinitely compound for them.
Another thing you wrote about in a couple different places is about effort. You wrote a capital gains piece about sort of incommensurable life advice, or how to sort of discern or the challenges of receiving giving life advice. And you also alluded to this post that Goran wrote about effort. Why don't you unpack what you found so interesting there?
Yeah, so I'm just perennially fascinated by the question of, suppose there are two people who both say they want to run a marathon. One of them runs a marathon. One of them tries to run a marathon and gives up either in training or makes it 10 miles in and then stops running. Whatever. I'm always very curious about whether the inner experience of the person who does it is it was just as hard for them to try and they tried a little bit harder, or is it that every single step of this was easier for them and it was just the natural next choice. And my suspicion is we do vary in just what is really easy for us to do, like what is an addictive behavior for one person that's kind of boring for someone else, and that anyone who is an outlier on achievement has probably had to put a lot of work into whatever it is they did. Like they probably started out talented, also worked really hard. And if they found it really easy to work really hard, then a lot of their advice is going to be misleading because they're going to forget about the part where you have to force yourself to really work, or they will underrate it. So I think it's just really important to consider that when you are comparing yourself to someone who has excelled in a domain that you don't excel in, but is maybe adjacent to one you do, or they have done X, Y, and Z, and you can do X and Y, and you're not so sure about Z. It may be that Z is the limiting factor, and Z happens to be something they're very, very good at. That doesn't feel very difficult to them. Paul Graham had some line about this where he said that he really likes editing prose and he really likes finding bugs, and that everyone else he knew in grad school thought this was a chore and he thought it was the most fun part, and that was just a really big advantage. It means that you can spend a lot of time working on the same thing and making it really good, and if you can put more time into one discrete piece of work, then you have an advantage. Like you can make it better than what other people would be doing. So it's annoying to write about this because there isn't anywhere to really go from there other than to just say you should definitely take it with a grain of salt because you just have different inner blockers than other people, and also nobody's really going to be aware of what those blockers are. Like you just have no idea whether your willpower exertion is 99th percentile or first percentile because there's no way to get in someone else's head and know how hard they try to do things that you find easy, or how little they struggle to do things that you actually find really, really difficult to do. So yeah, that was that piece on effort. And then the Goran piece was fun because it's a very Goran-y collection of anecdotes where he's talking about different discoveries and different efforts, mostly in the sciences, that were spurred by various kind of ad hoc motivations. And sometimes these are things like someone saying there's a solution. Sometimes these are things like someone saying this is actually, or someone not saying there is no known solution to this problem. Sometimes it's just overhearing someone discussing a problem and getting really obsessed with it. And I actually like that one. I felt like in this case, the anecdote in question, it was someone he had a mathematical background, but was not a professional statistician. And he overheard a debate over, given a certain accuracy with bombs at a certain bomb explosion radius, how many bombs we need to drop on a German airfield to ensure that we've destroyed 90% of it or something like that. And he overheard this and he kind of started thinking about the problem and then tried to participate in solving it. But it turned out that he did not have the security clearance necessary to get enough information to know if he was solving it or not. And so had to kind of work through something like that. And there's an anecdote that is fairly similar in the book Cryptonomicon, which I really, really enjoy. One of my favorite books of all time, where the protagonist is a math prodigy. He ends up in the Navy and he's given some kind of very, very low, like very simple math quiz just to figure out basically, is he numerate? And there's some question about how if you're floating down a stream and you drop your hat in the stream and you realize X minutes later, etc. And the character completely misinterprets this and thinks that it's actually a question about the flow, like it's a question about the flow of water and how the current works and things. And he fills a whole page of the paper with all these theorems and proofs and develops something new that he's going to publish later on. And then he hands it in and he fails the test. He gets a 0, but then someone identifies that he's actually a really brilliant guy. Anyway, I like that as kind of a punchier fictional retelling of this thing that actually basically happened, which is that someone very coincidentally overheard a problem that he just happened to for both reasons of skill acquisition and reasons it's just his general mental nature happened to be really, really attracted to. And I think maybe given that there are all these different examples, and I recalled another example of someone of Ed Thorpe asking Richard Feynman if it was possible to beat the casinos and being told probably not, and deciding that that was actually a good enough reason to try. So we have like this whole spectrum of different people who respond in different ways to being told, yes, it's possible, no, it's not possible, or not being told it's not possible, etc. And I think like the main lesson there is maximize your surface area, like try to encounter a lot of problems in a lot of different contexts. And if you find a problem where it really clicks and you can't stop thinking about it, that is a very good sign that you should work on it.
Yeah, that's a good explanation. I also wanted to circle back to the interview that we did with Tay about his NVIDIA book. What struck you about that interview, or what major takeaways did you have from either the conversation or the book that we're sharing?
So I think it is really helpful to have someone who's been watching this company from a long time and from both a financial and technological perspective, because it is one thing to take a company at a point that may or may not be its peak success, like we'll see, but it's always possible. Like anytime you take a snapshot of what are the most successful companies, which stocks went up the most in the last 10 years, there's some selection for skills, some selection for luck, and you don't know how much of which it was until very, very far in the future. And so if you look from the beginning, like a lot of things look pretty inevitable. Or if you look from that moment and look backwards, a lot of things look pretty inevitable. And the risks the company took look like they were reasonable risks at the time. And the contrarian things they did look very contrarian at the time. But if you're watching it from the beginning, then you do sometimes see other companies do slightly different contrarian things that do or do not work. Or you see that this company went down some rabbit hole, or you were thinking of NVIDIA as a graphics card company that the occasional hobbyist and scientist was using for some other purpose, rather than as a company that is just really, really good at building hardware to rapidly perform a certain set of mathematical operations. So I think having less of that hindsight bias from having just less of the story be pure hindsight is really valuable. And that's, again, hard, easy advice to say, hard advice to optimize for, of like, start looking for the next NVIDIA right now. Obviously, if that were easy, there would be a lot of us would be a lot richer. But I thought it was useful just to have that kind of perspective, have the perspective of someone who almost certainly remembers getting some NVIDIA quarter wrong like 15 years ago and being just, like calling Jensen the dumbest CEO who's ever lived or something, because he like everyone else makes the occasional mistake. So I thought that was good. And then it's always good to get just backgrounds on extraordinary people, and you always get this depressing result, which is they were actually pretty amazing people. For most of their lifetime, people encountered them and were like, this person really has something special going on. So like in Jensen's case, he was just really, really competitive at ping pong and got good at it, had this incredibly weird early life history, which I'm sure had some influence on him. And I think a lot of that influence was just forcing him to adapt to lots of weird situations very early on. And I think that's, sometimes you read that and you could sort of say to yourself, I'm glad that didn't happen to me, even though this is also why I'm probably not going to be the CEO of something like NVIDIA. But then, if you read the backstory of someone like Mark Zuckerberg, it's almost the opposite. It's like he had upper middle class parents, and they sent him to a series of just the best schools that you could possibly get into, and he did well in those schools. Was like learning Latin and in the fencing team and also programming. So in that case, you have more of like a linear path up, although Facebook certainly ran into plenty of crises that threatened the existence of the company. So maybe Facebook would be a lot bigger if the massive crises like that had happened a little bit earlier, or maybe Facebook would not be nearly as big because it just wouldn't be the same company if it had been started by a really ambitious sophomore at University of Michigan instead of at Harvard.
Yeah. It does seem interesting to compare, we were talking about Zuck and Elon earlier. Jensen is really the sort of long-term CEO in terms of sort of, when he became more famous, it wasn't sort of after a quick rise, in contrast to someone like SBF or even like Sam Altman or something. And there seems to be maybe a lesson there of like, SBF had this sort of golden boy sort of aesthetic. Maybe Sam Altman had that to some degree too. But as soon as they build you up, they can also tear you down. At least in the case of SBF, though Sam also in his own way has faced to those sort of ups and downs. Whereas Jensen, it feels like it's been much more smooth, or he feels like he's like kind of avoided some of those pitfalls. It's just interesting to compare and contrast sort of this kind of aesthetic among CEOs.
Yeah, I think one piece of that is just he sells an intermediate good, and it took a very long time for people to become aware of what GPUs are and why they matter. Like it took me a while too. Like I think I did not know what a GPU was until I heard the term GPU mining and had to Google it. So for a long time, I just kind of, I knew the computer was a box with various components that do various things, and I had this vague sense that one of those things is it draws things on the screen, but hadn't given a lot of thought to how that works and what kind of hardware you'd need for that, what other problems you could solve with it. I think so. That's one piece. The other piece is that because it is an intermediate good, its GPUs now are bought mostly by companies, and those companies are considering the ROI of one seller versus another seller, considering the ROI of do we buy it or do we use our money for something else, or we just buy back stock. That means that it's a lot harder to claim that anything has been faked. So there isn't a version of this story where we find out that NVIDIA was lying this whole time. You need a lot of people who are typing really, really fast to produce all these ChatGPT answers for that to be remotely plausible. So like even if there is some fall where we say in retrospect, he had way too much of a propensity to gamble and bet the company too many times, and one time it failed, I think we would still have to say he had a really good track record. He was a gambler with a positive edge who was slightly overbetting, and that overbetting did mean that he had a huge rise, huge fall. But I also there is this weird thing where people who are exceptionally ambitious and adaptable and could actually think fast and make good decisions, in a way their effective bankroll is just larger than it would otherwise be. So you can afford to skate a lot closer to the edge if you know that in the event of a crisis, there's just a lot of stuff that you can do to deal with that crisis. And also, if there is a crisis, you are probably willing to bluff your way out of some of it. So in some sense, if you do the strictly rational thing, but you don't take into account that you're very scrappy and you can deal with the inevitable blowups if they happen, it may actually be that people like that are systematically underbetting and not taking enough risk because they are thinking about too narrow a bankroll.
Yeah. I want to make sure we also get to a couple other topics you wrote about. One is you compared sort of the Y Combinator to the Nordics in your post around the large and small home market advantages. What do you unpack what you're trying to do there?
Yeah, so The Economist had a good article a week or two ago about Nordic economies and how they are very small as a percentage of global GDP, but they are overrepresented in lists of large multinationals. And that the small size of their home market is like this weird kind of advantage in the sense that it means that if you are selling furniture in Sweden and you're good at it, you very, very early in the life of your business reach the point where you dominate the Swedish furniture market in whatever your category is. And then you either have to say, I was ambitious enough to do this really, really fast, and that is exactly the limit of my ambitions, or you say, I'm going to keep going. And once you keep going, now you're competing globally. So you have to switch from being the best in Sweden, which is doable, for, like there are various Swedes who are the best in Sweden at various things, to best in the world, where the odds of that being you are a lot lower. But if you make that switch really early on, then you are always benchmarking yourself against larger, much more sophisticated global competitors. And you're always asking, what is an advantage that I can actually create that is a durable advantage that scales worldwide? Because just scaling from we're the biggest in Sweden to we also have a store in Norway is not, once you've done that, if you've demonstrated that there is this market for this category of company, then you have told all of your competitors to start competing with you. So you really have no choice once you expand across national borders to not be a fairly global business. And the analogy I drew with Y Combinator was with YC, there is this knock against YC that every YC company that is selling any kind of software to businesses, like, yeah, they get up to low six-figure ARR and everything is just revenue from other YC companies. But it's the same kind of thing where you have this very narrow market that's very, very accessible to you. You actually have a competitive advantage at it. Like there are basically no, I'm gonna check, there are like no other countries that speak any of the Scandinavian languages except those countries. Like the largest population of Norwegian speakers is actually in Sweden, and then the largest population of Swedish and Danish speakers is first and second gen US immigrants to the US from those countries. So they don't have a next adjacent market to go into. And similarly for the YC companies, if YC is selecting people who are fairly new to this, and YC is part of their business model is being kind of kingmakers and saying, yes, this team is a valid venture fundable team, and therefore you should venture fund them. That does mean that you have this small group of people to whom it is more straightforward to sell as long as you have a decent product. And then switching from selling to cohort mates with whom you have a lot in common and who you have very easy access to selling to the first stranger is actually really hard. But you have to do that, or your revenue chart over the summer that you spend at YC is going to be like, our revenue rocketed up until we saturated our TAM of the other YC companies in our batch. And at that point it flattened, and now we're getting churn because at least one of them is shut down. So, or pivoted. So you have to make that jump pretty early on. Now, one thing that does is it actually means that the failure rate's going to be a lot higher because you don't have very much of a core market. You don't have a lot of recurring revenue to fall back on. But it also means that the successes have to be more extreme because they immediately start competing at a much larger scale. And my guess is that that's a lot of what happened with the Scandinavian economy, is that they probably do have more failed multinationals per capita than most places, because it's really hard to compete with a Finnish company, or it's really hard to compete with like a German company and a British company and an American company and an Indian company if all the revenue that you have to fund all that competition is from selling to people in Finland. There just aren't that many Finns. But if you can do it, then you obviously become a large company by default. I think the other piece is the safety net, which The Economist talks about, where there's a more literal safety net in Scandinavian countries. If you fail, you're not going to be homeless. You're not going to starve. You're not going to be unable to afford healthcare. So it is okay to take a lot of risks. And I think in like the YC companies, they don't actually have a welfare state, but realistically, if you get into YC, you have to make a lot of mistakes before you don't have some kind of job to fall back on. And you were probably from a socioeconomic class where your parents or someone in your extended family does have a spare bedroom and you can kind of crash land for a little while. So there's probably some of that too, where each group, it is just, there's such a large gap between failing at this one attempt and failing at life that you have a lot more people who are willing to risk some level of failure.
Yeah, that makes sense as an overview. You wrote about China. Why isn't she scared of deflation?
Yeah, so he kind of goes back and forth. And I think with China, like, one thing to keep in mind is that it is a very credit-driven economy, and that they have just gotten less and less efficient at turning credit expansion into GDP growth over time. And at some point, you need a different model. You can't really you can have a lot of debt, especially if you're a large country that has aged. You end up with a lot of debt by default, but it can't go on forever. The interesting thing that Xi Jinping said recently, a couple of weeks ago, was that he still wants China to be leading the global economy and actually contributing to net economic growth. And that feels like something that, as China gets a bit more repressive, as the state gets a little more heavy-handed, it becomes less necessary. And there is now this generation where they have grown up behind the Great Firewall. You can, by default, you can be like a well-educated middle-class person and just not know a lot of fairly recent Chinese history because it's been very effectively censored within China. And so relying on economic growth has just become less existentially important to the Chinese Communist Party. But I think it still matters. I think it may still be just an easier default than moving towards the North Korea model of just no information gets in, no information gets out. And it's actually just a really fortunate historical contingency that we are at this point in history where China needs a new economic model, because the current model does involve too much credit creation, too much off-balance sheet borrowing by quasi-government entities, et cetera. And it is leading to this pretty deflationary spiral, which they are actually trying to address. Like, they are trying to get banks to stop buying so many Chinese bonds. There was recently a piece pointing out that for the first time in known history, Chinese government bonds actually yield less than Japanese government bonds, which is pretty crazy. I think if you told someone that was going to happen 10 years ago, they would not have believed you. But so China, they could move away from that model, but the fact that they still seem to be considering it, still want to try, is really positive. And so I think the historical contingency here is that North Korea did reach the point where they just could not stop information from leaking in. And they do have this really insane, it's like, I wrote about this a while ago because I was reading this book, The Real North Korea. Their economy is basically an anarcho-capitalist paradise, except that you have to pay bribes to the representatives of like the Stalinist God King. But if you pay the right bribes to the right person, the bribes are pretty nominal, then you can do just whatever. So there are all of these businesses that are doing imports and exports, or like there are government-owned mines that got shut down, and then someone pays the mine manager a bribe in order to operate the mine privately, and the private sector operator is able to do it efficiently, and so the mine is exporting again. Just a really, really weird, messed up economy. And one of the things that they have been able to import is devices with screens that allow them to watch movies. And so they can watch North Korea, or they can watch South Korean movies and TV shows. They see how South Koreans live. They can probably tell like these people are literally taller, and they look healthy. Their teeth are even, and they can clearly afford really excellent cosmetic surgery, etc. So they know that the standard of living elsewhere is higher, and that is, it's kind of weird the North Korean regime hasn't collapsed, but I don't know if that'll happen tomorrow or in 50 years. But I think if Xi Jinping is looking at that, he would have to say, okay, we really can't put the genie back in the bottle. Like, even if we have lots of propaganda telling people that their standard of living is really great and the rest of the world is really poor, they will at some point figure it out, and it will actually be a lot harder. Like they will be able to smuggle things from North Korea back into China and still see Western TV shows and still see Korean and Japanese TV shows and know what stuff is like out there. So I think they have fewer choices than they would have back when pure economic growth was the default choice, but it may still be the best choice for them.
Yeah. Lastly, is OpenAI screwed if they can't convert to a for-profit, or how should we think about sort of the sort of future for OpenAI based on the structuring?
So I was very coincidentally, I heard about an analogous situation, which the fundamental problem with OpenAI and their corporate structure is they started out as a nonprofit, and it made sense because if your big expenses are salaries and whiteboards and no one is hiring these particular kinds of experts, then yeah, it's fine to get by on donations. But as soon as you start recognizing scaling laws, and as soon as you start realizing that, hey, we could 10x our GPU spend and actually get a materially better model, then you do have to structure your entity in a way that it can absorb that capital and then give people a reason to put escalating amounts of capital in. Otherwise, OpenAI has just been an R&D project that told some big for-profit company how to build AI. And that was exactly what they wanted to avoid. Like, that was the worst case scenario. But when they were scaling, I don't think there was ever a point at which the most pressing item on the agenda was, hey, what should our legal structure be? And the faster they're scaling, the more that falls down the list of items on the agenda, until at some point it just gets untenable to have this incredibly weird situation where employees have equity, but it's not really equity, and the company's getting investments, but they're not really investments, and they have all these weird memos and disclosures. And clearly the board and Sam Altman were very, very misaligned on some issues in recent history. So yeah, at some point they did have to fix it. Now, the analogy that I found, which I just stumbled on this coincidentally reading something totally unrelated, was American Express, which in 1963, they had this huge accounting scandal where a subsidiary of theirs had been basically extending credit against inventories in a warehouse, and the inventories turned out to be fake salad oil. The scammer had this elaborate system where there were salad oil tanks. They had an internal pump, like an internal pipe system that would pump actual salad oil from one place to another in the tank so that inspectors would see salad oil, but the tank was mostly full of seawater. And it turned out that the Amex corporate structure had been decided when they were founded in, I think, like 1870s or something. And at the time, it was incorporated as an unlimited liability business. And when it started, it would have been closely held, and it was more in the business of transporting goods around rather than banking. And so it actually kind of made sense. Like, if you're literally sending someone through the Wild West when it is the Wild West, and you're sending them to transport a large amount of bearer bonds or gold or something. Like, you probably don't want to send the guy who says, by the way, I have a limited liability company, and so you can't go after my personal assets if I happen to lose this. It probably does help their trust a lot to be unlimited liability and say the partners are putting all of their possessions on the line every time they take a high value shipment across the US. But when Amex turned into more of a bank and was a publicly traded bank, this created this huge risk where if they have a large hole in the balance sheet, the shareholders may actually have to just personally make up the gap. And that caused a lot of people to sell their Amex, and a lot of them sold it to Warren Buffett, and the rest is history. And then they did quietly just reorganize as a normal unlimited liability company instead of unlimited liability, but they did it really late. And this was obscure enough that I asked ChatGPT. ChatGPT said no, that didn't happen, but it did. So that was a case where I think that there was probably at some point in some board meeting in Amex in 1890 or 1910 or 1940 or whatever, someone said, by the way, should we ever change this weird unlimited liability structure? And I'm sure someone on the board said, maybe at some point, but why would we do that right now? And then suddenly it's 1963 and the company may actually be insolvent and the stock could theoretically go negative. And that was the time when they wished they had changed it, but they didn't really have a time to do that until then. And, Amex, it's a normal upstanding company. It was a company where their brand name, their credibility was the most important asset they had. So if a company like that can screw up the paperwork and not realize what a big deal it is until it literally threatens their existence, then I think Sam Altman gets, some room to make exactly that kind of mistake.
Well, that's a good note to wrap this wide-ranging conversation. Byrne, as always, a great discussion, and until next time.
Yes, indeed. Talk to you next time. Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Riff. Please go follow and subscribe, give us 5 stars, and check out Byrne's excellent newsletter, The Diff, if you haven't already.